Cape Town, South Africa, and I'm a British solid waste management expert, mostly working with the World Bank and USAID now. So very exciting to be speaking with you today, and please do let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to throw a lot at you right now and kind of throw you into the deep end, and so you can kind of just pull on the threads which you find most useful, and we can discuss that in greater detail after the presentation. I wanted to try and skip through the solid waste management section of this presentation as quickly as possible, because I actually find it quite a rudimentary and unskilled professional space, lacking a lot of innovation. I think it's when you get more to waste recovery and waste recycling that you have more innovation and more kind of opportunity for private sector participation. Generally, I see solid waste management rather than an environmental or a utility-based service delivery value chain. I see it as a logistics value chain. So how far can you travel with your vehicle? Is your vehicle motorized or non-motorized? As in, are you a informal waste picker going to door, or do you have a compactor vehicle that's going to be very expensive to kind of operate on an OPEX level? The economic aims of the solid waste management sector in donor fields are very attractive. Solid waste management and even recycling has inherently low skill barriers for participation, which is why you see so many informal actors and kind of youth who are previously unemployed or underemployed in many countries getting involved in this sector. It's very easy. It doesn't have a lot of initiation costs. If you think of even micro trading or selling oranges or produce in a market, even with those professions, you would have to purchase a lot of equipment, or you'd have to purchase 500 oranges to start selling in a market. With solid waste management, you can be collecting plastic bottles off of the street, putting them into a bag, selling them to an aggregator or an recycling agent, and you've already created a micro livelihood for yourself. And then the other kind of idea is that in many developing countries, because solid waste management provision isn't able to attend to 100% of users, the World Bank will estimate maybe a 40 to 60% coverage rate for even basic solid waste management services in developing countries. And that's very often because the public subsidy doesn't exist for a sustainable waste service. And then you have a commodification of what is effectively a basic public utility service, where waste collectors are all competing over the large shopping mall or the big hotel, but negating the unplanned settlement, which has a lower propensity to pay for a service. Just go into this. So there are a couple of rules of thumbs which often get missed in waste management programming. A really common one that I've seen is the importance of waste transfer infrastructure. So you very often have dump sites and you have waste collectors, but if you're a non-motorized or a lightly motorized waste collector, you need waste transfer infrastructure within about a 5 to 10 kilometer radius of your base of operation. Otherwise, in all of the studies we've done, we've linked this with I go to this slide, with illegal dumping in riverways. So we've conducted in this slide, I'm just going to jump forward a little bit, a lot of GIS and drone flights over rivers. This particular study in Tanzania, Kenya and Ghana, which correlated the rate of illegal dumping into rivers with the lack of waste transfer infrastructure and unplanned settlements. Most of the people who are serving these unplanned settlements are operating with a rickshaw, like a tricycle, maybe 50 to 100 cc's, or just a handcart or a human-powered tricycle. So if you can think to yourself how far you would be willing to push, a supermarket carriage filled with groceries, probably a kilometer or two, and then at that point, it's going to become so tedious and law enforcement is going to be so weak in those areas anyways, that you're probably just going to dump it off the side of a bridge. So having these type of GIS tools, GIS and mobile solution tools have been kind of I'd say like a cornerstone of the work that I'm doing everywhere, and trying to identify where waste transfer infrastructure needs to be has been really important. Also appropriate technology. It's very easy to default to things like skip masters and compaction vehicles, especially kind of in European nations. You have the budgets, you have deeper pockets for affording this type of equipment. If you're working in rural areas or in developing countries, that hydraulic equipment breaks down very quickly. It's a very acidic, abrasive, organic waste typologies that you're working with in developing countries that aren't going to agree with hydraulic technologies like skip masters and compactor vehicles. So having appropriate technology is also an area that we work in a lot for best practice in solid waste. And that could mean going to something far more rudimentary. So instead of using a clean materials recovery facility technology, which could include kind of a X-ray and kind of eddy current flow separation of materials, you could just use a trommel, which rotates. You know, it's just a cylinder which rotates. It has different holes of different sizes, so things fall through while other things don't. It's not as complicated a lot of the time as people make it out to be. And I guess the point of this slide is that a lot of the time it shouldn't be complicated. It should be the simpler and the cheaper solution is the better one, particularly when working in developing countries with a lack of spare parts or a lack of maintenance capacity locally. This is also kind of another program that the World Bank focused on logistics again, logistics value chain planning. So RFID tags on top of households that were telling you kind of who had paid and who had not, and vehicle tracking, because maybe 60 to 70% of your business expense is going to be centered around petrol expenses, diesel expenses. And so if you can figure out kind of how to optimize the route planning through GIS software, that makes a massive difference in solid waste management planning. And now I'm going to try and get into recycling quite quickly so we can talk more about packaging. So here, a common misconception about recycling, it's not being pushed by environmental aims. It's being led by light industry and manufacturing. So for your USA program, when I saw light manufacturing, I saw bingo. You know, there's huge amounts of connections that you can make with that. A lot of the times, the plastic recycling sector, for example, is trying to mitigate the need for virgin polymers and import demands, particularly for landlocked countries or landlocked cities that are going to have trouble getting big container ships into their economy, or who don't have popular stop routes on the Belt and Road routes, for example. Very often with other materials like glass and metal, it's simply too heavy or too volume inefficient to export, so it stays within the country. So that's an area where you would look at kind of growing industrial symbiosis and industrial kind of enhancement within your country rather than focusing on an export commodities market like with plastic. And it's important then, you know, to get away from this infatuatory feeling of, you know, waste is wealth and recycling will pay for everything and will save the planet, and focus more on how each singular waste typology is supporting its own value chain and really has absolutely nothing to do at the end of the day with environmental efforts. It's much more about commodity markets and volume efficiency and logistical performance for your vehicles and for your export market. So a lot of the programs, I'd say 80 to 90% of them now don't focus on environmental aims. They focus on private sector development. They focus on things like trade facilitation. How can we support deep berth ports around the world that are serving this commodity market of plastic recycling? How can we incentivize source separation, material recovery facility infrastructure, foreign direct investment to prop up public-private partnerships? I'll speak about that a little bit later. And how can we create industrial exchanges in our own country so that things like glass and metal that are often too heavy to export are being reused locally? So specific to the packaging industry, what is best practice and what is very bad practice? You know, what can we advocate against and what are we advocating for? The kind of the headliner in this argument is against the non-recyclable plastics. So recycling plastic, which is what I've been speaking about in previous slides, is seen in the industry as a very low-hanging fruit. It's very opportunistic. It's very easy to call yourself a recycler. It doesn't cost a lot of money even to purchase horizontal balers and extrusion devices. It's really not that complicated if you were to compare it with kind of other forms of mechanical engineering. If you can start before the recycling process, if you can try and kind of get involved in the packaging industry and phase out non-recyclable plastics, which are very well known and which all have more sustainable alternatives. So I'm not going to the industry and I'm saying, you're going to have to lay off your 3,000 workers and close down your plastic factory because I'm banning single-use plastics forever, because that's going to be a very politically unpopular or unfeasible kind of option to get through. But I could go in and say, stop using plastics 3 through 7. These are these ones, PVC, low density, LDPE, polypropylene, polystyrene, and others, which could kind of contain the kind of plastic which is used for electronic waste, and just start using PET and HDPE alternatives because they exist, or compostable alternatives, for example. Another one which we really don't like is ABS. That's the one which is used on most laptops and cell phones. And then kind of working with these packaging industries to force them into kind of minimum quotas and minimum commitments and intakes of recycled PET and recycled HDPE. So they say for all of your new manufacturing items, we're not going to tell you to shut your factory down. We're not going to displace all of your employees because that's going to be too politically difficult. But you have really no good argument for saying that you need to use ABS. There's no good argument left in the industry for a packaging industry to say, I must use PVC for this item. For me, this is a little bit absurd. You know, a recyclable alternative in PET and HDPE will always exist. And plastics 3 through 7, even if they have the recyclable icon on them, are going to be so tedious to recycle that it's not going to be worth anybody's opportunity cost to get involved. So they're basically being deceitful if they're saying that those are recyclable plastic polymers. They never have been, and they never will be, because they take too much time and they're too tedious to sort. And then the other area that really needs to be phased out, again, it's not disrupting industry, it's not disrupting employment, it's just a little bit inconvenient maybe for the branding and marketing department of Coca-Cola. It's phasing out opaque PET. This means non-transparent plastics, like you see in this picture over here. It's very difficult and very tedious to recycle non-transparent plastic. It's also difficult if 100 different water bottling companies in Georgia have 100 different variations of the tint light blue for their water bottle. It needs to be a consistent packaging standard for water bottles, and it needs to be transparent. These bottles are almost impossible to recycle, and people in their households still feel they are recyclable, so they still put them in their recyclable bin, and then they break down the machinery. The machinery uses kind of optical light fragmentation. It shoots lights at the plastic, and based on the reflection, it has a computer science algorithm that sends plastics into different chutes when it gets to the materials recovery facility. These bottles that are non-transparent don't work with that technology, and so they end up not getting recycled. They also have a lot of additives in them. They'll have things called calcium carbonate, which means that I can't use float separation techniques. Basically, they undermine all of the recycling goodwill and efforts that have been put into the market. So they do frustrate people like me a lot, and they're just completely unnecessary. So these are things that we actively advocate against. For paper, currently the best alternative we have for a single-use culture, a culture which needs or wants to use things just one time, is paper. And you have seen kind of some industries like Heineken and Coke and Pepsi with very small amounts are getting involved now in beer or juices or Coca-Cola, you know, which can be served in a compostable paper alternative. So this is currently the best scalable alternative to single-use plastics, but it needs to be done correctly. So with paper recycling, less than 0.5% of the paper needs to be non-contaminated, which means it can't be wet, it can't be dirty, it can't have big duct tape strips going across the cardboard box, because then recyclers aren't going to take it. It's not going to be recyclable, even if you think it is. So a lot of paper, like with chips and crisps bags and fast food items, they have an aluminium inner layer. So on the outside, it looks like it's a bag of potato chips and it looks like it's paper. And on the inside, what they've done is they've put like a polymer aluminium sheet on the inside, which is why it's so greasy and so slippery when you have your fingers inside of the crisps bag, you know. That makes that paper not recyclable anymore. There's no way that I can separate that. And so it's really, really difficult and really, really unnecessary for these packaging industries to be doing that. and they know that it's not going to be recycled, and they know that they have alternatives. And so creating policy measures that aren't displacing people, you're not displacing in the industry, you're not saying that you can't operate anymore, you're just saying, give me a break, guys. You know, choose the viable and the scalable and the available alternative, which is going to make our life easier as recyclers. So some other thoughts on the USAID Economic Security Program, just from the very short time that I've had to wrap my head around it. You spoke about tourism. So I'll speak about some of the policy initiatives we've tried in previous programming. So you want to focus on consumer segments in your economy that are going to be capable, that are going to have the propensity and the pockets, the deep enough pockets to pay more. So hotels are really good targets for those type of things. Placing taxes on hotels that are in very remote areas in the middle of a national park, on a beach peninsula, for example. We have a program right now in the Seychelles, another one in Bahamas, another one in Cuba and the Dominican Republic. And you have these resorts that are producing 4, 5, 6 kilograms per hotel room per night that are 350 kilometers away from the nearest industrial center. And I've just spoken about how this is a commodities polymer industrial market. So the economics are never going to work naturally for a recycler to come to that hotel and transport the material 350 kilometers away before he can even start processing it. So putting taxes on hotels like that, ring fencing those tariffs to artificially subsidize a recycling market are very popular methods. And you can do that as well with passengers on an airplane, amusement parks, anywhere where very rich people go, where an additional $1 or $2 per night or per visit is not going to deter them from purchasing the product. And this effectively is saying that if you don't cross-subsidize this recycling value chain, it won't be able to survive by itself. Creative industries, you could look at things like upcycling and arts and crafts. For me, it's never going to present a scalable alternative to waste reduction, but maybe through behavior change communication, maybe through an awareness raising program, making earrings out of bottle caps or a house out of PET plastic bottles that are filled with sand is impressive and inspiring for environmentalists. And then shared intellectual services. There's a very late but rapidly expanding arrival of mobile technologies and e-services in solid waste management. If you think of it historically, it's been a very working class profession. It's been a very late adopter for things like mobile solutions and spatial analysis. But that's definitely getting involved now because waste management is transferring into this commodities market of plastic resins and plastic polymers. You have things like blockchain and RFID tagging to try and track accountability and track the movement of goods, particularly with these trash import bans that were announced in the last 3 or 4 years in China and in Asian countries. The importance of having things like prior informed consent under the new Basel Secretariat's amendments to the Basel Convention on exporting waste. You have to kind of use mobile technologies to prove now that what you're sending to China is actually a valuable plastic commodity used for the recycling market and not just waste that is too expensive to manage in your own country. On components 1 and 2, like I mentioned earlier on, I see the links with light manufacturing as very obvious. I actually always recommend to donors, don't call your program a solid waste management program, call it a light manufacturing and industrialization program, and then get solid waste management involved as a raw input. So paper pulping plants and tissue paper, for toilet paper and for serviettes and things like this, that's the main driver in most large economies for paper recycling. That's the reason why waste pickers and companies recycle paper. Or if the labor costs are too high in your country, that's why paper is exported right across the Pacific Ocean to other countries, because they want raw inputs. They don't want to cut down trees. They don't want deforestation. So they can take newspaper, they can take office paper, and they turn it into a lower grade toilet paper or tissue paper product. The petrochemicals industry, think of how big that is. Think of how multi-billion-dollar industrialization in the petrochemical industry. That's what's pushing plastic recycling. It's not infatuatory environmentalism, to what end? It's can I get a cheaper petrochemical raw inputs into my product rather than importing something. And this is particularly true for a developing country like Burundi, for example, or Uganda that has to import things through a third country. It can cost 3 times as much, in my experience, to get a container from Mombasa or Dar es Salaam port in East Africa to Kampala or Bujumbura in Uganda or Burundi as it takes to get that same container from Shanghai to Dar es Salaam, just because of corruption and bureaucracy. So finding a local alternative that can meet your quota requirements is a lot of what underpins the recycling sector. Beverage industries, again, for beer and bottling industries, are pushing glass recycling. It's not environmentalism, it's industrialization and light manufacturing. Agribusiness for compost. Composting is not a waste management solution. It's an ancient agribusiness technique that solid waste management planners stole from agriculture and called our own. So all of the composting techniques that you say today weren't invented by waste management specialists. They were invented by farmers hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And it's an agribusiness business activity, not a waste management business activity. And then any cement kiln that you pass by, or clay kilns or waste to energy plants, they're looking at waste for its calorific value, not for environmental purposes. They're saying coal and oil are getting really expensive. What else can I burn? And they'll go to the airport and they'll find there's super large amounts of airside waste, which is banned by the customs authority from coming into the country. And it's filled with paper and plastics and all of these other things got thrown away by the airlines during the flights. And they'll burn it because it has a lot of heat value inherently. So you're looking at supply and demand in an international commodities market, not environmentalism. You're looking at things like oil pricing and port access, and every specific subtypology of plastic will be supporting a completely different value chain and a completely different industrial angle. So the options for connecting these types of industries are really easy. And then the strengthening of institutions, having a packaging standards authority. These are being built quite strongly now in the countries that I'm working in Nigeria, in Kenya, and in Tanzania, where environmentalists and lawyers are getting together and approaching manufacturers and industries and saying, why do you keep on putting these things in PVC? Or why do you keep on dyeing your malt beverage or your energy drink in a non-transparent color and calling it recyclable? Because we can't recycle it. Our technology is incapable of recycling it. And we're coming to the table and definitely giving our 50%. We're not asking you to shut down your business. We're not saying that we're going to ban plastic bags, for example. We're just asking you to use a more sustainable alternative. And then component 4 on public-private partnerships. I mean, this must be at least half of what the donor programs are trying to do and what my work is trying to do. Solid waste management and recycling targets and standards are often led by national or international ratifications of kind of big name bills like the Basel Convention. But solid waste management almost anywhere in the world is a municipal function and is paid for through local tariffs like property rates. Like it's the same as your electricity top-up meter. It's the same as roadworks for a pavement in the local school district. It's not, national government isn't involved on a granular level with solid waste management services. So very often national standards and national targets for hitting recycling rates by 2050 or 2030, for example, don't translate into practice in municipal financing roundtables because you don't have enough money in the municipality or you don't have enough guidance or technical capacity to understand how to control this sector. So basic due diligence on contracting modalities and quality control. The second bullet that I've put is on minimum contract length. Municipalities are very used to giving a 1-year or a 2-year tender for municipal services like street sweeping. But if I'm going to purchase 5 compactor vehicles, that's going to cost me €250,000. I need at least a 5-year contract if you're reasonably asking the private sector to start co-subsidizing a public utility service. And then, this is a sector which really doesn't get enough attention from the private sector, and it could if you just tweaked a little bit of legislation. So preferential tax holidays, 100% foreign ownerships of companies, you're influencing foreign direct and domestic investment ineffectively providing a basic utility service. You're definitely helping yourself out by asking the private sector to get involved in things like solid waste management and recycling. So if you are a company that is recycling plastic, even if it's for industrial purposes, we're often trying to get taxes lifted or incentives provided to those type of companies to influence more investment in those areas. And then because a lot of these sectors currently are really struggling. I mean, if you haven't picked up yet in the sentiment of this presentation, the recycling sector is already on its knees, right? You have an oil price which is negative. You have COVID-19 export restrictions which are destroying the commodity markets, and you have all of this ignorance and tedious natures of having to kind of recycle opaque plastics and paper that has stickers and aluminium foil covered all over it. And then, hundreds of millions of citizens who are just not thinking past good intentions. They're thinking about saving the planet, but they're not thinking about the economics and the scales of economy necessary for having this sector survive. And so any co-financing that you can have in that's kind of like the hotel tax, ring fencing that tariff, cross-subsidizing that. The reason why that exists is because otherwise it just won't survive. This is not a very profitable industry. So anything that we can do to try and make it a little bit easier for the recyclers, we're trying to do. Carbon trading is a really big one there. If you can get somebody to come and say, for every kilogram of plastic that you recycle, you're saving this much carbon, and then the EU government will pay you through the Kyoto or the Paris Protocol a certain amount of US dollars for recycling. That's a great way to cross-subsidize a solid waste management or recycling activity that previously wouldn't have been able to survive. And then focusing on tariff mechanisms. That's why I mentioned contract modalities at municipality or city level. National taxes, usually in most countries that I work with, must go to the national treasury or the equivalent of that, the national bank. Even in the UK, if you have a tax, it has to go to the Bank of England and then it has to get redistributed, right? If you have a tax here in South Africa, like the plastic bag tax that we have in South Africa, it has to go to the national treasury. And if it goes to the national treasury, it very often disappears, which we could talk about in another conversation. If it's a tariff, it stays within the municipality and it can be more easily ring-fenced for funding a local activity. This is the last slide. I know I've gone probably over 20 minutes. The more obvious kind of mainstream packaging industry solutions, deposit and return schemes. You've seen that for glass bottles probably in your local supermarket. A lot of people are now saying apply that to electronics. So especially for linear electronic manufacturers like Apple Macintosh, which only might have 12 to 15 products that they're selling in their retail environment. And they'll sell you an iPhone for $800 US. Make it $850, and that $50 is only repayable when you bring back the iPhone after the 2 years that you've used it. The $50 times the hundreds of thousands of people that are buying iPhones stays in an escrow account. It gains huge amounts of interest for Apple, not that they need any more money, and they use that money to pay for recycling infrastructure within the Apple mechanism. So you could apply that to Samsung. You could apply it to more dangerous electronic waste items like refrigerators and washing machines. People who buy things like washing machines and refrigerators can afford to pay 5 to 10% more for that product. And that money can stay in an escrow account until that consumer returns that electronic item to a licensed recycler, and the interest made on the escrow will pay for the recycling service. So the same idea around pricing that builds a closed loop into value chains. Charge consumers who can pay more, and try and ring fence that money to cross-subsidize a recycling market that otherwise would not be able to survive. And then have preferences, like we've said, no opaque plastic, find PET and HDPE alternatives. Also try and have preference for things like very thick HDPE containers. If it's thick enough, people won't throw it away. They'll find some use for it. They'll plant gardens, or they'll use it for kind of another use. HDPE, when it's kind of when it's very thick, if you think like of it like an oil drum or a vegetable oil drum, which is HDPE, it's a useful item that can be used for rainwater harvesting or composting or gardening and so on. Another program that we worked on in Uganda, rather than banning plastics, because we found, the Ministry of Environment siblings all owned the big plastic manufacturing companies. So we said, instead of saying no more single-use plastic, because this was never going to be politically feasible, we went to large property owners and we said, we just want you to frustrate the consumer sentiment associated with single-use plastic. This is exactly the same thing that people did with smoking bans. They didn't say that you can't smoke. They just said that if you want to smoke, you have to go across the road and leave your friendship circle, and you have to stand on that street corner in this little, pen of an area in London and smoke there in shame, and so it's the same thing with single-use plastic. So the Ministry of Education in Uganda has basically said all schools, all universities, the Civil Aviation Authority in Uganda, the largest shopping mall chains, the largest property developers, they've said, we won't allow you onto our property if you're holding a straw in your mouth or a plastic bottle in your hand. We're not going to tell these industries they have to close down, but we're going to make it really frustrating for them to market their product, because the whole reason why plastic PET bottles took off with Coca-Cola or Pepsi, for example, is because it's convenient, because you can walk away with it, where 50 years ago, everyone in the entire world was using a deposit and return scheme for glass bottles for Coca-Cola. So they would always remember to bring back the bottles so that they could get their nickel or 5 pence back. So you're kind of doing the same thing. You're just frustrating the underlying consumer convenience of single-use plastic, just like smoking bans undermine the consumer convenience of smoking inside of restaurants. And then fewer policy restrictions. This is my last point on recycled PET and recycled HDPE. Very often, a manufacturer will say you have to use a virgin outer layer, and then you can use a non-virgin inner layer, and then another virgin inner layer for your product. So if this is a soda bottle or something which is containing a food, beverage, or medical item, they make this false claim that recycled PET or HDPE is inferior and might be holding a contaminant or a bacteria that will hurt the consumer. This is simply not true anymore. And so having fewer policy restrictions on those areas, or finding out in Georgia what are the policy restrictions on those areas, can definitely help out packaging and support best practice. I think this is the end of my presentation. I realize I've thrown a lot at you, so hopefully some of you have kind of found a specific area that you're interested in, if I didn't move too quickly.
Thank you, Joshua, for sharing best practices and also not so good practices. And also we have potential candidates for our ideathon, and probably people that are thinking of attending. So thank you for also giving advice at the end and sharing more information. I think it was very helpful. We have a question in the chat, so I will read it out loud. The author is Tekla Nadiradze. So according to some studies, biodegradable waste does not decompose on its own and necessarily needs to be catalyzed additionally. How will the degradation process in the environment be stimulated by new bacteria?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think one of my slides actively, advocated against oxo-biodegradables. So just for that sake, oxo-biodegradables aren't to be confused with compostables. These are plastic items that have been falsely marketed as compostable because they break down into small particles. What they really break down into is microplastics, which only exacerbates the problem. But you're right, compostables, they need, when you see compostable on the side of a container, or you think that you're saving the environment because you're drinking your coffee out of a compostable container, it needs to be composted in an industrial, state-of-the-art engineered composting facility for it to break down in the time that it says. So usually it will say something like between 6 months and 3 years, depending on what you're using. That estimate is based on it being composted in a sanitary engineered composting facility with professional composting professionals. Most likely, it's going to go to an uncontrolled dump site or a engineered landfill, where it will probably take 10, 15, or 20 years to break down. So that problem hasn't been solved. I would say it's a temporary mitigation on plastic usage. I would say even in an open controlled landfill or a sanitary engineered landfill, it is preferential to plastics, even though it is going to emit a lot of methane. You know, if you don't compost it in a composting facility, then that compostable item is going to emit methane gas. But if the only alternative is to use a PET bottle, which is going to take 10,000 years, then I would still prefer the compostable item.
Thank you. We also have another question by Julia. What approach would you take to encourage businesses to process their business plastic waste in the right way to make recyclers' life easier? We're coming across issues where business owners do not see the time that needs to be spent for collecting, cleaning, and drying plastics before they submit it to recyclers as something good.
Yeah, so I would say, like, based on this presentation, if you notice any of the plastic that you're recycling is non-transparent or colored, then definitely separate that out. I'm not saying throw it into your general bin, but try and put clear and transparent plastic maybe in one area and non-transparent plastic in another area. It doesn't matter if it's lightly tinted blue or lightly tinted green, but if you can't see through the bottle, then don't put it in the same place where you're putting the bottles that you can see through. And then the kind of the other name of the game in recycling is volume efficiency and aggregation. So if you can aggregate me a metric ton of plastic, which is probably going to take up as much space as a parking garage, like a one would probably take up the space that you know, like a small pickup truck. Then you're going to attract recyclers a lot better. If you can afford to spend something like $5,000 on a simple vertical baler, very often your local supermarket will have a vertical baler for crushing paper boxes. They're not difficult to use. They're not so dangerous to operate as a layman. You can crush those plastic bottles into much smaller bales, and recyclers will definitely come, I think, if you're offering them 10 or 15 bales, because each one of those bales might be 200, 300 kilograms, even if you're doing it improperly. So, you know, if you think of an empty plastic bottle like this container, it's like 70% of it is air, you know. So if I'm throwing it away in any vehicle type, it's going to be extremely inefficient to transport. And so recyclers aren't going to be very happy to pick it up. If you can somehow compress that and make it a bit more volume efficient for me, I'll send you a truck and I'll come and collect it. I might not pay you for the waste, but I'll effectively come and I'll give you a free solid waste management service for the plastic proportion in your solid waste management stream.
Thank you once again. I do not see any more questions in the chat section. So if any of the participants have any questions, you can either directly ask to Joshua now or write it to the in the chat. I think there are no more questions. Thank you, Joshua, for a very thoughtful and interesting presentation. I'm really, really hopeful that participants who have attended got some kind of inspiration on their business idea. So thank you for that. And I would say that just a reminder for the participants or for the people who are thinking of applying for Ideathon. The deadline is March 15th, so please hurry up. We do not want the full business plan for now. We just ask you several simple questions. So do not sleep on it, fill out today. Thank you, Joshua, and have a great day.
Thanks. Yeah, keep in touch and let me know if you have any questions over email. You're all welcome to contact me.
Actually, we have one last question, so I think we have several minutes to read out loud.
You bet, yeah.
So, are you aware of any pigments that can be used for plastic during the recycling process to color the mix before shaping an uncycled object?
Yeah, so sometimes a workaround for the opaque plastic challenge is just to dye everything black, and then you could use it for some type of item that you're wanting to make black. But I mean, I don't know many consumers who would be happy to drink water out of a black bottle. You know, I mean, they want to look inside of the black bottle. So, and the other problem is, you know, if I'm crushing with my industrial device, I need to be crushing hundreds of kilograms per operational hour. If I have non-transparent bottles now mixed in at this granular level with these tiny little flakes, it kind of contaminates my consignment. So when I export it, the person purchasing it for me is going to be, well, Josh, you told me you were selling me transparent PET flakes or granules, but I've noticed that 10% of them are non-transparent or black. Another issue with non-transparent plastic is it's very difficult to tell what type of plastic it is. You know, if it's in that granular level and there's tens of thousands of little fragments of that original plastic bottle, I don't know if it's polyprop or PET or PVC a lot of the time. And because it's non-transparent, it's much more difficult for me to run tests on it. So just trying to separate that non-transparent waste and trying to advocate against non-transparent plastic, I think is very important.
And Julia says that they are recycling HDPE into tables and street furniture, and with nice color pigments, the end products would be more attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on that, like upcycling, that arts and crafts level, you know, where you might need something like a few hundred kilograms per month on most of the operations I've seen, then that's fantastic. With my example for materials recovery facility, we need to be, you know, around 2,000 or 3,000 metric tons of plastic material per month to make those machines worthwhile. So we're going through millions of plastic bottles per month.
Nice. So I think this was it. And the one last information I'd like to display is that we are recording this webinar. So participants who joined a bit later, we will email you the full recording, so you will have the ability to like see what you missed out in the beginning. So thank you all for joining in, and thank you, of course, Joshua, for the interesting presentation.
Thanks so much, guys. Have a nice weekend. Great.